Welcome back. We'll now hear the next presenter. Please introduce yourself and you may begin.
Hello friends, my name is JJ McCullough. I am a professional YouTuber from Vancouver. I make videos in my apartment where I tell stories about history and culture with a focus on educating the world about Canada. Over the last 2 years, I have been a high-profile critic of the former Bill C-11 within the community of professional Canadian YouTubers. Now that C-11 has become law, I am eager to speak to you today to ensure that the perspectives of this large, important, and ever-growing community within the Canadian cultural economy are heard. A professional YouTuber is someone who uploads videos to a channel on youtube.com on a regular basis and whose videos are popular enough to generate enough revenue to make a living. YouTube, as I'm sure you guys all know, puts ads in videos, and some of the revenue that those ads generate is shared with the people who make and upload the videos. Many YouTubers also make money by selling merchandise or doing live shows and things like that. YouTube has become the internet's largest and most influential online video platform, which I'm sure you guys also already know, and Canadians have been extraordinarily successful on it. It's been said that Canadians may even be YouTube's most successful nationality per capita. My own channel has over 900,000 subscribers, with videos that are usually watched by a minimum of about 100,000 people each. For the last few years, I have been making a comfortable six-figure income doing this, which I would say is normal for a channel of my size. It is worth noting, however, that my channel isn't even that big. According to the website Social Blade, which keeps track of such things, I am only Canada's 358th most popular YouTuber. There are over 1,000 Canadians who have YouTube channels with over 100,000 subscribers. There are over 100 Canadians with YouTube channels that have over 4 million subscribers. I have a lot of friends who are professional Canadian YouTubers, and I've met with countless others at various YouTuber gatherings across North America, as well as their editors, assistants, and other employees. I am always impressed at what a diverse community we are in every sense of the word. Our opinions on the Online Streaming Act, however, tend to be pretty unified. One thing I really want to emphasize is that there is no widespread sense among Canadian YouTubers that ours is a community that is struggling or in need of government assistance. Success or failure on YouTube is not analogous to success or failure in traditional media realms like television, movies, recorded music, or radio. The barriers to entry are much lower, with the variables of popularity much more clearly democratic and meritocratic. I would like to talk about my friend Brogan as a case study. Brogan started his YouTube channel, which is called Art Chad, in 2021 to make videos about art and culture. Originally from Truro, Nova Scotia, he recently moved to Toronto, in part to be around more Canadian YouTubers. Brogan works as a bartender and makes videos in his free time. His channel has been growing steadily and recently passed 40,000 subscribers. If trends continue, his YouTube ad revenue will be enough for him to do YouTube full-time. Brogan makes videos in the living room of his small basement suite apartment with a simple camera and tripod. He edits them all himself, doing the graphics and sounds on his own computer. Brogan has benefited from being part of a large and supportive professional YouTuber community in Toronto. They give him feedback on his video ideas, they exchange editing tips, and they share knowledge about the life of a professional YouTuber. But Brogan is also the architect of his own success. Whether he succeeds or fails on YouTube will depend on whether he has the self-discipline and time management skills necessary to produce videos at a regular pace, whether he has the creativity to make videos that are fun and engaging to watch, and whether he understands the public well enough to make content that they will actually want to watch. I believe that professional YouTubers and other professional internet content creators increasingly form the backbone of Canada's 21st century cultural economy. And by and large, we are doing well because we know what it takes to do well. In the context of the CRTC's current deliberations, the point I most want to emphasize is that the Online Streaming Act must not be implemented in a manner that would punish the success of professional online content creators in order to create financial subsidies for legacy media. Without putting too fine of a point on it, Our material success should not be redistributed to artists, entertainers, and media corporations who have proven less adept at adjusting to the internet age. People talk about how the rise of the internet has created winners and losers in Canada's cultural economy, but I would hope that the success of Canada's professional online content creator community would be understood as an inspiring story of self-directed entrepreneurship and not an example of how big tech platforms have robbed money or fame from others. Canada's professional YouTubers and other online content creators are thriving in spite of government being relatively oblivious to us. I would hope that the Act will be implemented in such a way as to maintain this status quo of benign neglect to the maximum extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the panel, thank you for making the decision to participate in the proceedings and for being here with us, sharing your story, your friend Brogan's story. It's very helpful for us to have that perspective. I will turn things over to my colleague, Commissioner Naidu, to ask some questions. Thank you.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Thanks so much for being here today. I know you came a long way from BC, so, and also I think you win the prize for the most interesting computer, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. It's on my stickers.
Very
Yes.
usual. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions. In your intervention, you mentioned the importance of recognizing the existence of professional video content creators as a specific class of persons, and thus the existence of their interests in the Canadian broadcasting system.
Yes.
But the Act actually applies to undertakings, which is basically to say services, and it doesn't apply to creators. So I wanted to just dive down a little bit and find out what, in your approach, would you say that we should treat professional video content creators as undertakings?
Well, I know that this is kind of the hot issue, which is like, well, what work is content created by users sort of within this jurisdiction? And I talked a bit about that in my submission as well, that I feel like when we talk about sort of user-created content, you know, creator content in general, I feel like there's kind of a colloquial understanding of what that means, and then there's a kind of an understanding of what people in my community understand that to mean, which is something very different. And that's why I was sort of saying that I think that there would be some use, even if that use is just to clarify that when we talk about creators, when we talk about, for example, like users who upload content to social media sites, which I think is like some of the language that's used in the Act and in the policy directive, I think it might be useful to clarify that if in your perspective, if what I do does not fall under the definition of what it is to be engaged in a broadcast undertaking, then I think it might be worthwhile to just clarify that explicitly, to sort of say that, because for example, there is a line in the policy directive where it's describing, you know, this idea of that content creation of individual people is not under the jurisdiction, so on and so forth. And so there's a line that says, social media elements of their services, which includes any content created and uploaded by everyday users, commonly known as user-generated content. So like that sort of language, for instance, like that, when somebody like me reads that, uploaded by everyday users, like, am I an everyday user? I don't know, like, I'm a professional, like, this is my whole livelihood, right? So that kind of, I think, gets my community a little bit nervous, because we sort of think like, well, some of this language, and I said in my statement as well, you know, the kind of the colloquial conversations about, we're not coming after your cat videos and that kind of thing. It creates the idea that, you know, there's a class of person that's sort of uploading frivolous content, and that is sort of rightly, and everybody can agree that that should not be under the purview of the Act. But then if we think that there is this huge community of people that make a living, you know, through uploading content, who perhaps have employees who, you know, have tons and tons of subscribers and this sort of thing, I think that if I would not want to be, to answer your question, sorry, to just answer it directly, no, I do not think that we are engaged in broadcast undertakings, but I can see how someone might interpret some of the language in the Act as suggesting we are. So if we are understood not to be, I would like that to be very explicit by saying that that even includes people who are uploading content on a sort of professional basis, generating revenues from the content that they upload, which is also something that comes up in part of the Act as well that I would like to see.
Well, thank you for that. So you're basically saying that the language needs to be clarified.
It does.
So I wanted to get your take then. What would you how would you define the difference between a professional video content creator versus social media creator?
Well, I think that social media creator, I don't know what that means, right? Like it is, as again, like what we said, the quote that I just read you from the Act, where it sort of says, includes content uploaded by everyday users, and that's commonly known as user-generated content. Like, that is a problematic definition. But then also there's another part of sort of the policy directive where it says a social media creator means a person who creates programs that are primarily intended for online distribution as user-uploaded programs through social media services. So it's like, these two sort of different parts seem to contradict, in my opinion. So you're talking about people that create programs that are primarily intended for online distribution as user-uploaded programs through social media services. But then elsewhere in the policy directive, it sort of says content created and uploaded by everyday users, which suggests that there's multiple classes of people that engage with social media services. If that makes sense. I'm sorry, I didn't completely.
I think it does make sense.
Yeah. Can you just state that again, though? Because I want to make sure that I'm giving you a good answer to what you asked. So you're talking about like the thing that I do as distinct from a social media user?
Creator.
A creator, yeah. So, there is part of the Online Streaming Act, Section 4.21, that says that you guys are obligated to consider the extent to which a program uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service directly or indirectly generates revenue. And that part, Section 4.21, has been a huge source of contention in my community because of that little qualifier at the end, which suggests that there is this other sort of class of social media user. A social media user that uploads content to an online undertaking, but then proceeds to directly or indirectly generate revenue, and that this is supposed to be something that you guys are supposed to, quote unquote, consider, right? So when we consider that sort of language, coupled with this, the policy directive's acknowledgement that there exists something called an everyday user, and then that in turn viewed in the context of the existence of someone who's just a social media creator, right? Like all of these sort of terms, they seem to conflict and be contradictory and be confusing and ambiguous. And I just think some clarity is needed there. And I know, sorry to just add one other thing, is I know that you guys have explicitly solicited feedback on what even is social media, right? Which is this whole other sort of can of worms unto itself, right? There are some people that would say that YouTube is not social media. There's plenty of people that would say it is. But then to kind of come up with a definition where, YouTube and, X and Facebook are in one category, but then something like Spotify, like is Spotify social media? It has like aspects of it, but not. So I do think that some closure into just what even social media is necessary as well.
Right, and so definitions, of course, are important. Semantics are important, and I'm going to kind of stick with that for a second because I think it's part of what this is all about.
Yeah.
So Meta, Google, and TikTok all support a very broad definition of social media service.
Okay.
And the reason that they do that is so that definition can easily adapt to rapid technological developments and changes, right? TikTok also highlights that professional or commercial content, in their view, is very difficult to define. Google specifies that distinctions between amateur and professional content would involve very invasive data collection requirements, and it would also involve developing new algorithms. So you've touched on a little bit of the language argument, and I'm wondering if you can comment on these positions by these big players.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with them. Like, broadly speaking, me and I think a lot of people within my community are kind of on the same side as a lot of the tech platforms as far as these kinds of conversations go, which is that we don't really want to see our content audited in any sort of invasive way, as you said, in which, the CRTC or whoever is kind of going over our content with a sort of fine comb to determine like when we've crossed some arbitrary threshold into being, professionals and then thus have to be regulated in a different sort of way. So, my inclination, and again, like the only reason why I bring up that the existence of a professional content creator is significant is primarily so we can be protected, not that we be regulated further. Right. So that's just the kind of point that I'm trying to get at. And I do think that, this is an issue where I think the creator community, the professional creator community, and some of the tech platforms that host our content, we may disagree on a whole host of other things, but I think on this issue, we're generally in sort of broad alignment. I didn't know that about that they favor a sort of broad definition of social media. That's interesting.
sticking with definitions.
Yes,
Michael Geist,
Yes.
you've probably seen some of the stuff that he's said at the hearing and what he's written about. He is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, and he proposes, again, to very broadly define social media, a social media service, to be clear, as quote unquote, platforms that predominantly consist of third-party user contributions. And in that view, a broad definition would ensure that user-generated content would not be caught by regulation, since, quote, again, a quote from him, regulation of user-generated content would erect significant barriers to entry for Canadian content creators and artists who depend on user-generated content platforms, most notably members of equity-seeking groups, unquote. So I'm wondering if you can offer your opinion on his position?
Yeah, I think that seems like a decent definition. I'll tell you what one of my concerns is, though, is that if we do create a different sort of category of online user uploaded content that is some way, I'm trying to think of how to describe this, right? So it's like, if you're like an amateur user or even like a professional amateur like me, I guess you could sort of say, but then we know that, for example, like CBC, CTV, they have YouTube channels as well, right? Or, Warner Brothers or whatever, like big media corporations have, social media accounts and they upload videos and all this kind of stuff. And I think that a concern would be that if those people are in a different sort of category, if they're not considered like third-party uploaded content, they're like in a kind of content that is in fact under CRTC jurisdiction in some way, that then that becomes the content that is then favored in any sort of discoverability sort of mandate, right? So like if the CRTC sort of brings about sort of rules that say, YouTube or Spotify or whatever has to make good Canadian content more discoverable, more promoted, and so forth. That the way that the regulations could be crafted could unintentionally sort of give a boost to the sort of the people that perhaps need it the least, which is the entrenched old guard media sort of entities. That I sort of said in my statement, I think that my community is very wary that, our success will be punished in order to elevate the people that are already the most entrenched, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that if we can agree that the cat videos are not under CRTC's jurisdiction, but then like the J.J. McCullough's of the world are also not under the jurisdiction, but we say that like, well, CBC and CTV and Global, their content is, and we can also all agree that their content qualifies as, Canadian enough to deserve promotion and so on and so forth because they've gone through the traditional CRTC, loops and all that. I think there's a concern that then they would wind up benefiting the most from sort of the promotion, discoverability sort of regime that would be brought about. So, but I'm sensitive that this is a very difficult circle to square,
Well, and that's why we're here, to have
Yes,
these
indeed.
discussions, right? And input really matters. So you mentioned discoverability.
Yeah.
In your intervention, you mentioned that professional YouTubers are concerned about the discoverability of video content produced by professional YouTubers. Because basically discoverability produces views, which of course generates income, which is, what it's all about, I guess, for professional YouTubers. But YouTube and other similar services arguably have enough of a discoverability function built into their operations that many social media creators are arguing that there is just simply no need for regulatory intervention. So how do you respond to that?
I think that that's true. I mean, I think that, like I said before, like a platform like YouTube, which I just have to speak to because it's the one I know the best, it's very market driven. It's very public opinion driven. It's very taste driven, very preference driven. It's very meritocratic and very democratic in that sense. The sort of videos that you want to watch are the videos that pop up in your recommendation feed. And that's based on a very sophisticated algorithm of understanding what you're into. I mean, I know that the government might have a position that Canadians can't sort of be trusted, their own tastes are perhaps, not patriotic enough or whatever, and that we need to be consuming more Canadian content, whether we think we want to or not. And I think that's in part what sort of the discoverability sort of tweaks are designed to do. They're designed to sort of emphasize that Canadians perhaps should be watching more Canadian content, even if they're not actively seeking it out on their own accord. I know that that's a kind of ideological preference that maybe I don't personally share, but I know that that is kind of the logic of the legislation. So I guess that you know, that's, I suppose, a decision that you folks will have to make, right? Is to what degree are we comfortable sort of disrupting the existing sort of algorithmic system on a social media site like YouTube that is very public focused. It's very based around the tastes of the users and feeding the users the kind of content and the recommended content that they themselves want to see. To what extent are we comfortable sort of intervening into this system that I think the vast majority of users of certainly of YouTube and I think of most social media programs would sort of say works broadly well for their viewing experience, for their experience as consumers of content? And to what extent are we willing to disrupt that in the service of some sort of larger kind of patriotic good of the kind of content that we think they should be watching, even if they perhaps don't know that they do?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about funding now. Last week we heard Digital First Canada, who indicated that the current funding bodies are insufficient and incapable, this is a quote, of aiding digital creators in Canada, unquote. They also mentioned the lack of resources for digital first creators as a barrier to work on applications for funding, for example. So I'm wondering if you can comment on any other types of barriers faced specifically in your view by professional video content creators and or social media creators, and what are the needs and how can they be better, how could they better contribute to the objectives of the Act with appropriate support? What do we need to do to support that?
Well, you know, it's like I sort of said in my opening statement, you know, I feel like we know what we need. And frankly, I feel like most of what professional content creators need is just, you know, self-discipline, you know, work ethic, you know, sort of entrepreneurial skills and this kind of thing, community, you know, support within sort of a peer group and that kind of thing. You know, the overhead is often very small, right? Like to make professional content, you know, I film in my, you know, even though I'm more successful than my buddy Brogan, you know, we have in some ways a very similar sort of setup. You know, I just film in my living room. He films in his living room. Maybe I have a slightly better camera than he does. I have one kid in Ottawa that helps me edit. And, you know, he has nobody. But, you know, the overhead is pretty minimal. And I think that mostly when I talk to content creators, it very rarely comes up, the idea that we don't have access to, you know, government funding. You know, we just heard from the radio folks and the documentary folks before then, right, where they feel like that they're working in this very overhead heavy sort of industry where the funding just isn't available and that they're having a hard time making ends meet and, you know, sort of collapse and failure is just around the corner. I think that a lot of professional content creators just don't see themselves in a sort of analogous position. And so I think it is true that obviously a lot of the sort of the funding regime that exists to subsidize cultural industries in Canada are not available to professional online content creators. But I also just kind of think in my own experience that doesn't seem like something that's very front of mind concern for most of us. You know, we know what it takes to succeed, and you can often succeed, again, with remarkably low overhead costs, just because you're just, you know, you're fundamentally sitting in front of a camera. You know, you don't require a ton of, you know, huge expensive recording studios and radio broadcast towers and license fees and all this kind of stuff, right? So I think it's true, but I would think that my personal opinion is that that's perhaps a little bit of a distraction. You know, I think that, well, I mean, I don't want to get too much into my own personal preferences for it, but all I can sort of say is that I think that when you talk to professional online content creators and you ask them, you know, what's holding you back? I don't think it's very often a funding issue. I think it's more just like a time issue, you know, and you know, their ability to actually, this is a very important point I want to emphasize, is that one of the biggest things holding, I think, professional content creators back is an inability to understand what the public wants. You know, it's a very public-facing profession. You're trying to make videos that people will watch. You know, how many times we spend all this time thinking like, oh, I got to make the best thumbnail, the best title, you know, is it engaging within the first 30 seconds? Are people going to keep wanting to watch? So like, those are the kind of things that are front of mind, not our access to sort of funding streams.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Those are all of my questions, and I'm going to turn it back to the chair. I know that other panel members may have questions as well. Thank you.
Yes, I think we're very much enjoying this discussion. I'm going to go over to Commissioner Levy. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you for being here. I hope that you take comfort in the fact that just as we do not regulate actors and writers and journalists, we are not particularly interested in regulating YouTube creators either. So that to one side. Where do you see your profession, if you like? How do you see your future? How do you see iterating and growing and using the medium to either do bigger things or transitioning into something that is more of a mass media provider?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that I think that when a lot of times I meet with sort of professional online content creators, YouTubers and that, and sometimes they're given opportunities to work in television or to work in sort of conventional legacy media or even make movies and things like that. And a lot of times they turn it down because what we have going for us now is pretty good. You know, our audiences are huge, our reach is enormous, it's global as well as being national. And so, like, you can do almost anything that you can do in conventional media online and on a lot of these online sort of social media platforms like YouTube. You can make amazing documentaries, you know, you can make news coverage, you can make, you know, all sorts of music, you can do it all, really. The platform is, like I said, is I think the kind of the cornerstone of a 21st century Canadian cultural economic space, Canadian cultural economy. And so personally, like, I don't have bigger dreams than YouTube, I must say. That might be sort of surprising to hear, perhaps. And I think a lot of YouTubers don't, really. I think that where they see the platform is, like, YouTube is a remarkable platform. Like, I can just upload a video and it's there. It's easily shareable. People can see it all over the world. It can be as big budget or low budget as I want it to be. So, I mean, my thing is that as long as YouTube is continuing to thrive as a corporation, as long as it's still able to provide the resources to people like me to host the videos, I'm doing pretty well. And that's why, you know, even though what you said is, I think, technically true, that you guys are not in the business of regulating creators, the way in which you regulate the platform does trickle down and have consequences, particularly as it relates to things like discoverability and stuff. If you're going down the line of sort of saying that we want to promote the discoverability of certain types of creators over others, then that does have consequences for me, and that is a sort of de facto regulatory consequence for the kind of content that I make. And I suppose when I sort of think of the long-term future of myself and others, it is really the sort of the cloud of ambiguity regarding future regulation that is, I think, the source of a lot of stress and worry for how any of us are going to be able to continue to pursue our dreams.
You heard the earlier interveners from Legacy Radio who are doing their best, it seems, to access the advantages that the digital world provides, but are still, you know, struggling mightily because of the impact of that the online streamers have had on the entire ecosystem. What would your suggestions be to legacy media to overcome some of their difficulties?
It's really difficult, isn't it? You know, because, you know, and I don't want to be too ideological or political about this, but, you know, are we entitled to succeed in our chosen field, right? Like, are we entitled to have success in any sort of profession that we choose to pursue? I would argue my own personal preference is that sometimes no. If I open a bakery and my bakery fails, you know, am I entitled to be successful as a baker? You know, if I open a bakery in a terrible community where there's no interest in the baked goods I have to offer, you know, who has failed in that position? Have I failed? Has society failed me? Has the government failed me? I don't know. These are ultimately sort of like philosophical, ideological questions that have to be answered. You know, I think that when a lot of Canadians, particularly younger Canadians, hear about radio stations failing, they think, well, that's just how it goes. You know, industry, technology marches on, and there's always winners and losers. And I think that there is concern, as I said in my opening statement, at the idea that at a time when there is a huge, thriving, sort of forward-looking, modern, youthful wing of the Canadian cultural economy and cultural space in the form of online content creators who are often very entrepreneurial, very self-directed, people that have started from very little and have become very successful, in some cases some of the biggest celebrities in the entire world, simply by starting out making content or music or videos in their bedrooms or parents' basement or whatever. The idea that those people are in perhaps in some way like a problem that now needs to be solved in order to sort of subsidize people that, you know, God bless them, are sort of clinging to perhaps a dream of success in a medium that there just isn't market or public demand for anymore. So, you know,
But there's also responsibilities that go with those things. You don't have to worry about public alerting. You don't have to worry about weather reports that or forest fires and warning people to get out of their homes and things like that. You don't have the obligation to try to find emerging artists and giving them their first leg up. All of those artists Canadian artists that you see that are doing so well on YouTube, they don't go immediately from that necessarily to worldwide stardom without the assistance and the grateful and acknowledged sort of the honor that we have to expose Canadian content, especially emerging Canadian content makers, to the world. And that comes from the legacy broadcasters. And so I take the entrepreneurial approach as, obviously extremely successful and very advantageous. But I still believe that you have an awful lot to offer to legacy media. And I would, I'm looking for notions for how you might work together to the advantage of everybody and cover off some of these very important public policy issues. I mean, you don't have to worry about reflecting equity-seeking groups. You don't have to do any of that, but they do. And I wonder how you might work together.
I mean, it's a fair question. You know, I do sort of find, I don't know, I guess I just always sort of like wonder, what is the public's role? What is the consumer's role? The consumer of media, how do they fit into this equation as well? You know, oftentimes when media is not commercially successful, the justification is made that they possess a kind of like moral worth that should not be sort of discarded or discounted. And I think that you can make that case very easily. You can say things like, you know, the sort of the humble radio station or whoever is making news of a higher quality than anything that can be found online, and perhaps that's the case. But then the public's role in this has to be factored in as well. And if you're making the highest quality content in the world, and if it's, you know, heavily subsidized by the state or whatever, but if that content is not being consumed by the public, then what public good is really being served, right? To me, that starts to cross the line into which the subsidy is existing for the benefit of the creator, not the benefit of the public. And so that's just kind of a sense that I just want to make very clear, because that's definitely how I come at these kinds of things. I think very deeply about the public. I think very deeply about the public interest. I try to make content, you know, and not all YouTubers can perhaps say this, but I try to make content that is uplifting and that is socially useful and valuable. I try to make content that's educational and informative and helps broaden awareness of this country, both domestically and around the world. But, you know, the problem is, I think that there are a lot of creators who come at this, and, you know, perhaps for the best intentions, but they don't have a clear sense of how their good intentions and their kind of moral sense of the project that they're undertaking, they don't have a clear sense of how the public factors into that. You know, it's like, if I do the best content that I can possibly do on my radio station or in my newspaper or whatever, you know, that's all well and good in the sense of giving you a sense of validation and pride in your work, and perhaps the government will reward you for it in various ways. But again, it's like, if the public's not consuming that content, then I just think that we're suffering a severe disconnect between the sort of mandate that organizations like the CRTC have and the sort of policy solutions that are being offered in the pursuit of that mandate, if that makes any sense.
Well, I don't think that we're trying to feed people's feelings of self-entitlement.
Not entitlement, but I think, like, you know, a lot of people come to these sorts of things and they have a very sort of righteous sense of the good that they're doing, right? And perhaps they are doing good, but I'm saying that, like, we have to have a public like there has to be some sort of metric in which we can evaluate whether the public agrees with that assessment of the moral good that they're doing. Whether that's a moral good in the sense of like, you know, our content is more educational and more credible, or our content is more, you know, like patriotic and like serving the sort of the Canadian, you know, cultural interest, right? Those are things that people can conceptualize their work as doing. But again, I do think the public has to have some role in being able to like agree or disagree with those assessments.
Well, your business is, of course, the front and center with that because you live or die by what the
Absolutely.
public wants, and so I fully appreciate where you're coming from, but and also the fact that yours is a place of incredible innovation, and I think that's certainly worth sharing more broadly. I think it was Steve Jobs who said people don't know what they need until you give it to them. And yours is a space where that happens in spades. So congratulations, and thank you very much for appearing. I'll turn it over.
Okay, thank you very much. I will turn things over to Vice Chair Barron.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. McCullough. This is a very interesting conversation. And you mentioned consumers. So I want to talk to you about business models because we're very familiar with the traditional model for legacy media. And in that model, you monetize eyeballs, right? And we have standard measurement tools that can validate that if you have X amount of eyeballs, you're going to generate X amount of advertising, and then that advertising goes directly to the broadcaster. And so the YouTuber business model is slightly different, and we had Google before us, and they said, well, this is providing access to this business model is a huge advantage for Canadians, and this is our contribution to the system. But then we had some legacy broadcasters before us who said, well, if we look at the business model today and we air a program and we get a certain amount of viewership, we can see that there's a direct relationship between the viewership and the revenue that we're generating. But on our YouTube feeds, we don't understand, because we had CHCH who said we can have 1 million viewers and then we get the check from YouTube, and there doesn't seem to be that much of a correlation. And I think what they were expressing was that that particular business model was not as transparent, and that they did not see the link between the viewership and the revenue that they were getting from YouTube. So I'm asking you, because you are clearly successful in this space. It is allowing you to earn your living by reaching viewers directly. Do you have the same concerns, or is it just that particular example that is probably an outlier?
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately, from if I understand what you're asking correctly, like, I think that the answer is that it comes down a lot just to the particular advertisers that you're getting on any given piece of content that you're posting online. And I can't speak to how it works in television or any other traditional medium, because that's not what I know. But, you know, for example, in the YouTube world, it is conventional wisdom that, say, if you make a channel about economics or like financial planning and stuff, that you'll generally make much higher revenues than if you're making a channel based on cooking or something. And that's just because the advertisers would rather advertise on a financial advice channel, which they know will be watched by people that have money, right? As opposed to a channel that has a more broader, less financially, So like, it's the same way that it's like, a Super Bowl ad pulls in bigger revenues for the broadcaster than, an ad on just an ordinary football game. Part of that is that, the audience is bigger, but also part of it is sort of like, the assessments that the advertisers make about the sort of people watching the Super Bowl, right? And so, I mean, again, like, I can't speak to, I assume that this must still be the case in television. If you watch late night TV, you get a different sort of advertisement than if you're watching, prime time, right? So that to me doesn't seem like, a super revealing argument about anything in particular. I think that in all industries, you kind of understand that, yeah, it's not a one-to-one. You know, you don't get $1 for every eyeball that you have, or $100 or whatever. It does vary a lot on the nature of the advertiser. And that's, yeah, something that I struggle with. You know, because I make videos on a pretty broad range of topics, and sometimes a video that seems like it was a big hit, it got, you know, tons and tons of views, generated less revenue than a video that perhaps got fewer views. Or sorry, did I say that right? Yeah, a video that might have been viewed less might have somehow made more money than a video that got viewed a ton. And again, it just kind of comes down to like, well, what was that video about? You know, what kind of advertisers were advertising on it? And also, I should also note that, you know, YouTubers also sometimes contract their own advertisers independently of Google. And I think that's something that should be noted as well, is that we're not entirely dependent on Google's advertising model. A successful online content creator can contract independently with their own advertisers too, and that's a huge part of the revenue generating model, in addition to even other things like selling merchandise and doing shows and stuff like that.
This is very helpful. Thank you. Back to the chair.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Vice Chair Scott.
Thanks very much. This has been great. Following up on kind of the business model discussion, I'm always intrigued by market dynamics and how that can shift between the creator of the content, the platform over which it's carried. How do you feel about the current dynamics as a creator? Are you worried about platforms being a gatekeeper and changes in their business models that could cut you off? Do you feel that your content is strong enough that you can take it where you can find an audience? What are those dynamics, and are there vulnerabilities there for Canadian creators?
I wouldn't say that there's vulnerabilities for Canadians in particular. As a nationalist, or as a sort of national group, I don't think there's any reason to think that that is at all a sort of consideration. I mean, people within the professional creator community on YouTube and elsewhere, they do stress a lot about algorithms, right? Like the algorithm is this like mysterious god that rules the world, and you know, YouTube is always sort of dicking with it in various ways, and like you never quite know. You know, like whenever people have a video that doesn't succeed, they always say, oh, it's the algorithm, right? Like YouTube has like this secret sauce behind the scenes, and that determines whether your video, you know, succeeds or fails. And there has been like a kind of movement for algorithm transparency, and that, you know, I mean, and this becomes sort of part of a larger kind of social media conversation that has been in the culture more broadly, particularly when it relates to like young people. You know, what kind of content are these corporations feeding our people? You know, I said earlier that, you know, what they tell us is that the kind of content that you're recommended is the kind of content that you're interested in. And I think the abundance of evidence suggests that that is indeed the case. But, you know, there is some sort of stuff going on behind the scenes in which it is not always clear what kind of videos are getting promoted and which ones are being sort of, if not necessarily openly suppressed, but at least kind of like downplayed in people's recommendation tabs and so forth. So, I mean, like that definitely seems like one of the biggest kind of concerns with the business of YouTube. And, you know, I'm sure this is the case with the business of Spotify and TikTok and, you know, X and Instagram and all of this kind of stuff, right? It's I think like in the majority of cases, I don't want to overstate this, I think in the majority of the cases, the algorithms work well at recommending the type of content that people are interested in consuming, you know, to Canadians and to any user. But I do think that there are cases in which there are still mysteries of this. And, you know, the corporations guard it pretty jealously. They sort of say that this is our success, this is part of our business model, and they're not necessarily interested in opening it up to the public. And, you know, I guess that's their right. But I would say that those kind of concerns are pretty small in the grand scheme of things.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So just perhaps before we turn it back over to you, I know that you had raised some questions around sort of what's covered, and I do want to say, I want to go back to our registration decision and be very clear. This is straight from our decision. For the sake of clarity, users that upload content on social media platforms are not subject to the Broadcasting Act and therefore will not need to register. There is no distinction there between sort of, you know, casual or, you know, everyday users and professional users. I know you referred to the policy direction. I know you've raised other issues around the impact of regulating broadcasting undertakings and the potential impact there.
But also the business that that the Commission is explicitly told to consider whether or not those user-generated content generates revenue. Like that, to me, is a significant qualifier. As I said, that has been a source of some concern.
Right. Okay. So thank you for that. We will turn it back over to you for any sort of concluding thoughts.
Okay, I honestly didn't really sort of anticipate concluding thoughts, I'm sorry to say. But one thing that I guess I just, this has been an interesting experience for me. I'm just some guy. I'm not part of like a lobby group or an organization. I've spoken with some YouTube folks on occasion, but like I'm not their agent. I'm not speaking on behalf of YouTube. I speak only for myself and my ability to hopefully reflect the kind of consensus opinion that I feel like I have absorbed through my own activism on this legislation. When I walk around in Vancouver or elsewhere, people often recognize me on the street from my YouTube channel, and increasingly all they want to talk about is this. Like, I am known now as like the Bill C-11 guy. So this is like a bill that is of extraordinary interest to the public. And I feel like sometimes I worry that the public's perspective on some of this stuff is not being heard sufficiently. I think that processes like this are very valuable and very important, but I do worry to the extent that they sometimes seem to be dominated a bit by special interests, by people who know how to navigate this system. I probably could have put more effort into learning how to navigate this system. I was a little bit overwhelmed by it personally. And I'm a busy guy with my YouTube channel and all this other kind of stuff and traveling around and all that. But I just hope that when you guys are considering, how you're going to bring this legislation into the fore, that you do consider the public interest and to what degree, the public's perspective on some of this stuff is heard or not heard. And as well, the perspectives of folks like myself in the community that I'm sort of grandly hoping in some small way to represent. There's sort of the class of small-time social media, online content entrepreneurs. Because like I said, I just really view us, whether we're streamers or YouTubers, TikTokers, artists on Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever, like we are really the growing force that is defining, I think, the Canadian cultural economy in the 21st century. And I think even though we're new, we're not particularly organized, we perhaps don't know how to navigate a lot of these kind of complex bureaucratic structures. I think that our perspective is very much worth hearing, and I hope to continue to participate in this process however I can, but I also hope that other voices like myself are heard, and if they're not being heard, I hope that people are taking the action to solicit their comment.
Thank you for that. We couldn't agree more. Your voice is a very important one. We hope that you continue to engage in future processes, and as well as other social media creators or online creators, however you refer to them. Thank you for the very substantial conversation today.
Thank you so much. It was great.